Sarah sat in the small living room staring at the overdue rent notice, her fingers clutching the edge of the paper until it crumpled. The silence of the apartment pressed against her ears, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She thought about David, how he would react if he knew she hadn't paid for 2 months. He was already carrying so much on his shoulders, working late shifts, stumbling home with exhaustion in his eyes, barely noticing her presence before collapsing into bed. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the words never made it past her throat. He would see it as failure, and worse, he would see her as weak. So she chose silence, telling herself she could find a way out. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Khan, the landlord, politely reminding her about the rent. He had been patient for weeks, but his tone had changed recently. The last time he came by, he didn't even pretend to be formal. His eyes lingered longer than they should have, and his voice had carried something unspoken when he said, "We can discuss options." At the time, Sarah brushed it off, telling herself she was imagining things. But tonight, with the paper in her hands and no money in the bank, those words returned, heavier than before. She thought about David again, about how distant they had grown. Once, he used to notice her every gesture, laugh at her silly jokes, touch her with affection that made her feel alive. Now, conversations had become mechanical. Dinner, bills, work schedules, nothing more. Intimacy was a memory, replaced with tired sighs and empty spaces between them. She craved connection, craved to be seen, but instead she was invisible in her own home. The loneliness weighed more than the unpaid rent. When Mr. Khan knocked earlier in the week, she had let him inside. He asked her bluntly if she had the money, and when she said no, his smile curved in a way that unsettled her. "Sarah, sometimes rent isn't only paid in cash," he said, letting the sentence linger. She froze, unable to respond. He leaned back on the chair, studying her, waiting for a reaction. "Think about it," he added before leaving. She told herself she would never consider it, that she had dignity, that she loved David too much. Yet here she was, days later, her mind circling those words like a forbidden song. She placed the notice on the table and buried her face in her hands. Every path seemed blocked. She couldn't borrow from family. She had cut ties when David married her against their wishes. Friends were scarce. Pride had kept her from admitting how dire things were. She thought of going to the bank, but with no collateral and David unaware, it was impossible. Every attempt to solve the problem ended with the same conclusion: she had no options. Except the one she couldn't admit out loud. Late that night, while David was still at work, Sarah stood by the window staring at the streetlights. She replayed Mr. Khan's expression, the way his eyes glinted with knowledge of her desperation. He had the upper hand, and he knew it. What terrified her wasn't only the possibility of giving in, it was the part of her that wanted someone to notice her, someone to acknowledge that she existed beyond being a wife buried under bills. That small, dangerous part whispered that maybe this was her escape from invisibility. Even if it was wrong. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Mr. Khan: "We should talk. Come by tomorrow. Just between us." Her heart pounded as she read it. She knew what he meant. She wanted to delete it, to pretend it never came, but her thumb hovered over the screen, betraying her. She didn't reply, yet she didn't block him either. That silence was its own kind of answer. When David finally returned home, he kissed her forehead absently and went straight to bed. Sarah sat at the table long after, staring at the phone, feeling both guilty and unseen. She whispered to herself that she would never betray him, that she loved him too much. But beneath those words was another truth she couldn't silence. She was already standing at the edge, and one more push would tip her over. The clock struck midnight, and Sarah folded the rent notice neatly, slipping it into the drawer as if hiding it could erase the problem. She lay beside David, listening to his steady breathing, her chest heavy with secrets. She closed her eyes, but the image of Mr. Khan's smile returned, unshakable. The rent wasn't just money anymore, it was a choice, one that would test everything she thought she. Sarah woke the next morning with the weight of unspoken decisions pressing down on her chest. She moved through the motions of making breakfast for David, hiding the storm brewing inside. He barely noticed her silence, leaving quickly for work, promising to return late again. As the door shut behind him, her phone lit up with another message from Mr. Khan. "Are you coming? I'll be waiting." Her hands trembled as she read it, knowing that ignoring him was no longer possible. The rent notice wasn't going away, and her silence had already told him more than words ever could. She convinced herself she would go only to reason with him, to buy time, to beg for another month. Yet when she entered his apartment, the air felt different, charged with something she couldn't deny. He welcomed her with a calm smile, offering tea as though this were any ordinary meeting. But his words were direct, stripping away pretense. "Sarah, you know why you're here. You need a solution, and I'm giving you one. No one has to know. No consequences, just relief." She opened her mouth to protest, but the sound died. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You deserve to be seen. You've been invisible too long, haven't you?" His words cut deeper than she expected. She thought of David, of nights lying beside him feeling more like furniture than a wife. She thought of her loneliness, the craving to feel wanted again. She hated herself for listening, hated the rush of warmth his attention sparked inside her. She whispered that this was wrong, that she was married, but even as she said it, her conviction felt thin. Mr. Khan didn't push, he simply waited, letting the silence expose her conflict. The decision happened not with a declaration, but with her failure to leave. She stayed, letting him draw her closer, letting the invisible line she swore she'd never cross fade into nothing. Every thought of resistance drowned under the reminder of the rent, of her isolation, of the hunger she pretended she no longer had. When it was over, she sat in silence, trembling, her mind screaming that she had betrayed everything she once held sacred. He spoke softly, almost soothingly. "You're safe. No one will ever know. Your rent is taken care of." Walking home afterward, Sarah felt the weight of her guilt pressing harder with every step. The streets seemed louder, the faces of strangers sharper, as though the world itself could see what she had done. She wanted to cry, to scream, to confess, but when she reached her door, David's shoes by the mat and his jacket hung neatly on the hook silenced her. She entered quietly, carrying her secret like poison in her veins. That night, she couldn't meet David's eyes. He talked about work, about how exhausted he was, never noticing her distant gaze. She nodded at the right moments, forcing smiles, but inside, every word reminded her of the lie she had created. When he touched her hand, she flinched, then quickly covered it with a forced laugh, pretending she was just tired. The shame was unbearable, yet beneath it lurked something more dangerous, that the memory of being desired. Days passed, but silence wasn't enough to contain what she had started. Mr. Khan sent her casual messages, short, taunting reminders that he knew her weakness. "You handled it well. I enjoyed our arrangement. Come by again, it won't take long." At first, she ignored them, but the fear of eviction and the lure of his validation gnawed at her. When he mentioned his friends, she froze. "They'll be generous. You'll never worry about money again," he wrote. Her stomach twisted, disgust and fear battling inside her. She typed a refusal, but deleted it before sending. She knew silence was as good as surrender. That evening, lying awake beside David, she stared at the ceiling, her body rigid with dread. She told herself she wouldn't go, that she would never allow him to drag her deeper. Yet she also knew she had already given him power. One mistake had bound her, and now he was pulling the strings. She thought of leaving, of confessing everything to David, but the image of his disappointment, his anger, his rejection, froze her in place. She chose silence again, because silence delayed consequences, even if it chained her tighter. When Mr. Khan reminded her of their next meeting, she didn't argue. She didn't agree either, but she knew she would go. Her resistance had been chipped away, her dignity traded piece by piece for the illusion of control. She whispered apologies to David in her head, promising herself this would be the last time, just once more to secure safety, just once more to keep their life together. But in her heart she knew that line she once swore she would never cross was gone forever. Sarah woke before dawn, her eyes wide open while the room remained in shadows. David slept soundly beside her, his face relaxed, unaware of the storm she carried. She turned onto her side, staring at him, and felt an ache she couldn't name. He had given her a home, a name, a promise of forever, and she had shattered it in silence. She wondered if he could sense it somehow, if his body knew what his mind had not yet discovered. The guilt lodged in her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. The days blurred together after that. She went about her routine with mechanical precision, cooking, cleaning, pretending, but inside she was unraveling. Every time David touched her hand or asked about her day, she recoiled inwardly, afraid her eyes might give her away. The lie grew heavier, stretching the space between them. He didn't question her, but his glances lingered longer, as though he noticed her distraction even if he didn't voice it. Silence became their language, and in that silence her betrayal screamed louder than words ever could. Mr. Khan didn't let her forget. His messages arrived with casual cruelty, reminders that he held the strings. Sometimes it was a single line, "You know where to find me." Other times it was more pointed, "Don't make me remind you what happens if rent isn't paid." She deleted them quickly, but the words burned into her mind. She knew he wasn't talking about eviction anymore, he was talking about ownership, about control. Her first surrender had given him power, and now he wielded it without hesitation. Sarah told herself she could resist, that she would never go again. But the fear of exposure, the fear of losing everything, kept her chained. She looked at David and imagined his anger, his disappointment, the way his trust would vanish in an instant if he ever knew. That fear kept her silent, and silence became compliance. Mr. Khan didn't need her permission anymore, her lack of protest was enough. 18 night, when David came home exhausted, she tried to act normal. She cooked his favorite meals, asked about his work, laughed at jokes she barely heard. Yet every smile was painted on, every gesture hollow. She could feel the gulf widening, not from his distance but from hers. She had built a wall of secrets between them, and no matter how close he sat, he was on the other side. She lay awake listening to his steady breathing, thinking about the choices that had brought her here. One missed payment had spiraled into a chain of compromises, each one heavier than the last. She wondered when exactly she had lost control. Was it the moment she let Mr. Khan linger in her doorway, or when she didn't delete that first message? Or was it long before, in the quiet erosion of her marriage, when she became invisible and hungry for recognition? The apartment no longer felt like home. Every corner whispered of her betrayal. The kitchen reminded her of the mornings she avoided David's eyes. The living room reminded her of the nights she sat alone, waiting for him while her phone vibrated with messages she should never have answered. Even the bedroom, once a place of closeness, now felt like a stage where she acted the role of a faithful wife while carrying secrets in her skin. She thought about leaving, about walking away from it all, but where would she go? She had no family to run to, no friends to confide in, no money to stand on her own. David was her anchor, yet he was also the person she had betrayed most deeply. She was trapped between the man she loved and the man who owned her silence. That contradiction ate at her until she felt hollow. Mr. Khan's confidence grew with her compliance. He no longer asked, he instructed, and each time she obeyed, the shame grew sharper. She told herself it was the last time, over and over, but the cycle repeated until even she stopped believing her own lies. She wasn't just paying rent anymore, she was paying with pieces of herself, and there was no balance left to cover the cost. One evening, after David had fallen asleep beside her, Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, tears sliding silently down her face. She turned to look at him, his features softened in sleep, and felt the full weight of what she had done. She reached out to touch his hand but pulled back before her skin met his. She no longer felt worthy of his touch, of his trust, of the life they had built. The distance between them was no longer physical, it was permanent, carved into her by choices she could never undo. The truth of it settled over her with crushing clarity. Nothing would ever return to the way it was. She had crossed a line that erased the possibility of innocence, of honesty, of peace. Even if David never discovered her betrayal, she would always know. She would live with the memory of Mr. Khan's voice, his control, his smirk when she stayed silent. She would live with the knowledge that love alone hadn't been enough to keep her faithful. And that knowledge was its own prison, one with no escape.